here today with Patrick McGinnis from Dirigo Partners based here down in Soho, New York City. Patrick's a real veteran of Latin American investing, especially investing in entrepreneurs and new startups in the region. So Patrick, to start out today, give us an idea of what excites you most about the IT outsourcing industry of Latin America.
I think if you look at the macro trends in Latin America, there's a couple of things that make the region really interesting. First of all, you've got a region where the overall macroeconomic growth is positive and there's political stability largely. So it's a good place to do business. That's sort of from the beginning. Number two is you have rising education. So you have the sort of overall level of human capital increasing over time. And number three is you have a culture that has developed over time of sort of service firms that are used to working with global clients that expect high quality. So you have groups like Tata that have come in and they're all over the region. You have shops that have been set up to build software for clients in the US and Europe. And you've built a culture of quality in places where maybe 10 years ago that didn't exist. I started looking at the space in Brazil in the year 2000. I invested in an IT services company, and at that time most of their clients were Brazilian, and while we were an investor they won some business in the US, and getting them to the level where they could service that client was very difficult. We look 10 years later, 12 years later, and you see it's not at all uncommon for companies in Latin America to service companies in the US, and so they're used to the demands of a client like that.
One of the things that comes up a lot in this space, Patrick, is the issue of scalability and really finding the right talent to fit the roles required. What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, I think that's definitely an issue. If you look at certain markets in Latin America have become known as hubs for outsourcing work or IT work, and if you think about, it's not a surprise that a place like Mexico or Argentina, or I guess Colombia now, we see more and more of that happening, and that's a newer market. But if you look at the constraints, you have a market like Brazil where there clearly are constraints, costs are rising, it's expensive to do business. And so you see that it's difficult to find good talent there. And what's happening is that there's become a culture of outsourcing within the region itself. So you'll have a company in Brazil outsourcing its IT to Chile or to Argentina. You'll have, or even Colombia. I've heard of e-commerce companies in Brazil, and I won't name names, but a major player that does all of its IT work out of Colombia now. So I think that is going to be a persistent challenge, and the way to overcome that is through education and through investment by firms coming into the region and creating jobs. There's going to be a lag between probably demand and supply.
Is it your perception the ITO space in Latin America is ripe for investment right now?
I believe it is. I've seen over the years a number of opportunities in both sort of the IT services space and also in call centers. Call centers has seen a lot of consolidation over the last 5 years. I first looked at a call center in Latin America in the year 2000. It was a Mexican call center. And the premise was that we were going to do business for the US Hispanic community out of Mexico. It was very interesting because the first client that they were able to land was doing English language out of Monterrey, because there were no US companies that were willing to hire in Mexico for US Hispanic because they hadn't yet figured out how to attack that market. Here we come all these years later. It's a very established marketplace. And I think you're going to continue to see that kind of growth. What will be interesting is to see how the IT services piece will consolidate. Because obviously you have very large players like Tata, as I mentioned before, who are building out in Latin America. But there are lots of smaller companies that are well run, but that really haven't figured out how to penetrate the US market. I've had several CEOs come to me and ask me how they should attack the US market, being a Chilean company, for example. And they know that sales cycles can be long. They know that finding a good salesperson to put their flag here in the States is going to be difficult. And so figuring out how those companies can build businesses here rather than just sort of consolidating into a global player will be an opportunity, because if they can do it, there'll be tremendous growth and investment opportunities.
Mm-hmm. Something, Patrick, we were talking about earlier was this wave of entrepreneurs, people who are from Latin America but coming to the United States, taking advantage of the market here. Tell us more about that wave and how you perceive it growing.
It's a very interesting trend because we saw it 10 years ago in a different way. So in the first wave of entrepreneurship in the tech space in Latin America, you had entrepreneurs who came to the United States and built their company in Miami. And then they would use that base in Miami to attack the Latin American audiences. They'd open up offices in every country in Latin America, and they'd open an office in Spain, and they'd sort of be burning millions of dollars a month. What's happened is pretty much the opposite. Now you have people who can build businesses very inexpensively. What you could build for $1 million, you can build for 100,000 or less. At the same time, these entrepreneurs have figured out that there's a really interesting opportunity, not just in terms of cost, but also in terms of quality, to arbitrage labor between Latin America and the rest of the world. So you have entrepreneurs who are from a country that set up a development shop in that country to build the platform for their tech business, and then they come here because this is where the market they want to attack is located. And what they've done, which is really smart, is that because they're from these countries and they've got great relationships, they're able to really leverage the resources in Latin America much more effectively than somebody who's sitting in New York, has never even been to Colombia or Argentina, and hires a firm as an outsourcer there. Mm-hmm. So I think that trend of of entrepreneurs who have a foot in Latin America and a foot elsewhere in the world is a very interesting model. I think we're going to see more of that. And as an investor, it's a model that I really like.
So you and I both know that the Latin American startup scene is really starting to build up. Is the traditional investment community of the United States paying attention to that market?
Well, it's interesting. So I think a lot of the VC interest in Latin America is really about Brazil, and it's around the Brazilian market because obviously Brazil is a huge market. It's growing quickly. It's number 2 in the world in Facebook, Twitter, and Tumblr. It has all those macro sort of and demographic trends that people like to see. Companies that are in the rest of Latin America and have operations there, but not Brazil, and or companies that are sort of hybrid may require a little bit more understanding because I think it's easier to open an office in Brazil and sort of attack that market with a local partner than to sort of fish around looking for companies that are maybe a little more complex or operate in secondary markets. But the entrepreneurs who are able to overcome this are those who basically position themselves as a US company that's leveraging a presence in Latin America. And I think that story, if it's told in a very simple way that doesn't sort of muddle the story, is not particularly complicated. People do that all the time with India or China, and Latin America is a new place for doing that.
You've obviously been doing business in this market for quite a while. What are some of the horror stories or lessons you can share with us?
The great thing about the horror stories from Latin America is that they're great for cocktail party discussion, so at least you get something out of that. But I think my personal experiences have been, number one, you need a great partner. I mean, it's any emerging market, obviously, but you need a partner who you can trust and who values your participation in the relationship. So it's not just that you found a person that you can trust and work with, but that person also sees that you're bringing something to the table. That's number one. Number two is I think you need to be, I strongly feel that you need to at least speak one of the languages in those nations, either Portuguese or Spanish or both, because it makes a big difference when you sit in a meeting and you're able to interact very effectively in the language of your counterparties. And I've seen people who sort of come in on a plane, have never been to a country, fall in love and start throwing their money around, oftentimes are the first people to get back on the plane when things get a little tough. And the third piece of advice I'd have would be really to make sure that incentives are aligned between all of the parties in a transaction. And that comes down to, I mean, part of it's clearly a contractual issue, making deals that make sense and making sure that they're papered correctly and having good lawyers to make sure that they're papered correctly. But obviously, enforcing contracts in a place like Latin America is not that easy. And if you end up in a local court, it can be expensive and time consuming. So more than just putting a deal on paper that makes sense, you really need to build the relationship that supports the transaction or supports the business opportunity. And you need to be close to your partners and really build a relationship it transcends just business. It's almost to the point, I think, Latin America has a reputation of being a place where business melds into personal lives. And I think as Americans, sometimes we're not used to those types of relationships, or it's something that we may find a bit different than what we do. But you need to go very local. You need to really know the people you're dealing with, and you need to see the relationship more holistically than just simply business.
And finally, Patrick, if you could identify maybe 2 or 3 markets that you're really hot on right now, what would they be?
Yeah, so well, I have several for different reasons. I think Mexico is clearly going to be the pretty girl at the party in 2013, 2014. Everybody's talking about Mexico, and I think it's sort of fallen under the radar a bit because of the PR issues it's had as a country. But having just been in Mexico and seeing what's happening there, I think, number one, you have very good local talent, but number two, that proximity to the US is going to become more and more interesting. So I'm a believer in Mexico, in the next couple of years. Brazil, I think it's going to continue to be interesting. I think with the Olympics coming up, there'll be more global focus. There's going to be more capital coming, and the overall dynamics that have pushed growth in the digital sector should continue. And then Colombia is my third. Colombia has such tremendous human capital. If you go to secondary markets in Latin America or the Caribbean and you go to a factory, the middle manager is always a Colombian, because Colombians as a culture are just very competent managers. And I think you're seeing now the repatriation of that human capital back to Colombia. And you're also seeing the fact that there's lots of Colombians who have lived in both the US and in Colombia, given all of the difficulties in the 1990s. So you've created a class of upcoming entrepreneurs and managers who are very comfortable operating in the US and in Colombia. And I think that's going to be a huge competitive advantage for Colombia.
Patrick, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.